Hello and welcome to the final episode, or perhaps I should say epilogue, of the UNFC podcast.
We wanted to give an overview of the series in this episode and sit down in discussion together to see if the series answered the questions we had at the start, as well as the new things we've learned.
We'd also like to thank all of our listeners for tuning in so far, and please also like and subscribe and share more widely if you can. But most of all, we'd like to thank all of our guests for coming on and speaking with us. So back in episode one of the things we mainly discussed was what were some of the main points and things we wanted to get out of this series. One of the things for me that was really important was understanding that interlink between how the UNFC and other existing systems kind of coexist, but also some of the incentives that are driving mining and exploration in particularly in the EU, and how that context is kind of changing, and how does this look, and is it fit for the industry as a whole.
Nice. I think it was an interesting series as well, diving into that, because we had this experience of people who've been around the subject for a while felt that it's not necessarily in conflict with the Crisco codes or anything like that, but maybe that's a common misunderstanding of it when people are first encountering it through a strategic application. I thought that particularly Ed Size and Tom Bide's episodes really digging into the nuance of that, but also that difference in purpose, and both that kind of holistic project overview and the circularity element that Tom proposed, but then also that really important history lesson from Ed as to what these things were invented to do and their true purpose, and that means it's different both in the past, also now in the present in the CRMA, but their goals are different and what that's going to lead to in the future. So just because you encounter it for the first time in a strategic project application doesn't mean it's trying to come in and muscle out Crisco. It's being used at a higher level than that. I think was probably quite a key takeaway on that one for me.
I'd completely agree. I think this very much viewing UNFC as this higher level system tool over Crisco, which that isn't to diminish Crisco in any way. It has a very, very valuable role in sort of protecting investors. But UNFC, I think, very, very much can support the understanding of where resources are at a national, regional, supranational level, let's say looking at the EU with its Critical Raw Materials Act.
Yeah, I think for me as well, it was that why should I care piece, which is always something I always like to come back to. So I think from someone who's spent a lot of time understanding or working with exploration projects and how does the Crisco fit into it, that episode where we spoke to the UN and that kind of where did the history of this come from, like you said, Chris, the history lesson of it actually gave me a lot of context to understand their ambitions for how it is what it is for the future, but also kind of where's it come from as a classification system. The fact it is just fundamentally different to a type of reporting system. It's not comparable really to what Crisco is there to do.
I really like the point that Erica Ingvald made in that episode as well, about that kind of like pattern analysis level that it can give you at that inventory perspective you were talking about, Alex. I thought that's my new favorite UNFC point, which I am firmly pinching and trying to credit every time I tell somebody else it, because it's not my own original thought, but it's no, I really like it. And again, it's that, yeah, you might have to fill it out in a form, and that feels like a like for like replacement, but it is trying to do something different from a strategy level. Alex, your focus was all on the data side. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess I was curious from the start, sort of, to see the data story, and I think pretty much each episode touched on it one way or the other. I guess what I was really trying to see is, in people's opinion, is there suitable data in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, in terms of accessibility, and is that out there to really get sort of UNFC to its full potential?
Yeah, for me, what was interesting hearing Nicole and Purple Rock's perspective was that as someone who's not based in the European Union, just how they presumed a lot of data would be easily accessible and shareable and just out there, and how it just isn't. And then also not just from Nicole, but from some of the other episodes, there's a consistent theme across that. I think we see UNFC as a system where you have to align with it, you must put stuff in, but in essence, it's basically just a framework that shows people what could be, what data could aspire to be. I think that was one of the things that kind of was a bit of a reframe, a flip of my perspective on what it is.
For me, looking at, let's say, Europe compared to Canada, I think that's a really good point, because they're both arguably federal systems. Maybe there's a bit more autonomy, I'd argue, in Europe than Canada between the sort of subunits. But the element that really applies of each different sort of fractured jurisdiction often has their own data, their own laws, their own licensing, their own prices. But in a place like Canada compared to Europe, it's a lot more unified, which I think really does help unlock access to answering all these UNFC questions. Let's say, I mean, we're possibly about to get onto it, but the e-axis, trying to make sure that let's say for industry or for governments, that they have good access to maybe not a centralized repository, but a good sort of one-stop signpost way of accessing and understanding what data there is and what data they need to answer these questions, so they can, pretty much going back to what you just said about Chris, what you just said about Erica, actually using it as this sort of portfolio of projects.
Yeah, and I guess it's also touching on that point before we jump into the e-axis, which was my big question at the start of this, on that kind of data lens, and you talked about kind of municipal or jurisdictional constraints. That really gets to the crux of maybe the misunderstandings about the Critical Raw Materials Act as it is. It's an EU piece of legislation, but all of the actions have to take place at a much more localized level, and there's actually no mandate for that the EU can extend. But that's where you see like projects like GSEU, which is an EU Horizon project, trying to standardize some of that data and centralize it. So I definitely think that there is a real take home about that regional importance. The e-axis is interesting because that's what I, as a sustainability professional, get really interested and excited by, is that equal weighting element. I think it was also, again, interesting to get that experience from Ed with the Crisco element. But even just between some of the experts that we had come in from that, be it, we had Rose, Clark, Ben Lepley, and Eva Marcus particularly come in and focus on some of these elements from individual episode perspectives. You hear someone like Ben's talking a lot about the opportunity to impart kind of sector-specific mining-related standards into that e-axis as how to do it. You've got someone like Rose who's talking more generally about the sustainability, kind of not necessarily applied to the sector, but broader what we're seeing within Europe with CSRD and more globally in ISSB. Then you've got Eva who's focusing on that implementation phase of, okay, so what do you do rather than having a data checklist? What's the like framework for being a good steward in something like UNRMS? So I thought it was interesting to me that there were so many different interpretations as to what good application to that e-axis really looks like. And of course, I had my own preconceived ideas, and some of that was reflected in what was said. But I do think, it shows just that sustainability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and so we have to provide a framework that's flexible enough to get the best of all of those bits in there. And maybe UNFC is something that can do that, but it probably requires a little bit more application and best practice guidance to plant that flag.
No, I agree. And probably picking up follow on from that, Chris, is that kind of one of the things that I consistently heard in a lot of the episodes was this kind of ambition for it to be like a communication tool or like a shared language that's kind of that could be used as a translation tool or something like that. And that was something I really didn't think it was useful for, or that was an ambition of it. Do you guys have any reflections on that?
So while it wasn't covered in an episode, I'd really like to read Victoria's master's thesis that was brought up in the UNECE episode, because I believe that's kind of, that's a lot of what Victoria really looked at, and she was talking about a lot of that accessibility of information in it. At the end of the day, a lot of people work in raw materials, but they're not actually necessarily competent interpreters of or confident, maybe is a better word, interpreters of a Crisco code report. That's why we have competent people, and it's whole home chartership and world. We do need something that spans those boundaries. We've been talking for years about how we need these communication tools to engage other stakeholders, and here you have one. And yet the first thing that most people want to say is interpret it as something that wants to muscle out a very specific type of report. So I do definitely think it opened my eyes to it. I love the visuals of the 3D cube. It's pretty easy to understand. And then obviously there's the report for people who want to go into it. So if you think you're throwing a memo into someone's hand who's a maybe policy decision maker, and all you can, you've basically got a rating of it's no chance in happening in one corner through to this is a great project in another, because it satisfies all three elements. It's pretty easy graphic to give someone for them to get some context on an element. So I'm a big fan of that for sure.
I mean, I'd like to build on what I think you said and what people said in the podcast itself several times. I think Tom By did, Rose Clark, which is not everyone is necessarily an expert in everything. And I think it's actually really important to admit that. And whether it's UNFC or Crisco, when it comes to resource classification, doing it in a responsible, modern way, you need really a team of experts. And sometimes that can be very hard to achieve. But a very necessary thing to do to actually bring these people who are, let's say, an expert in sustainability or an expert in the exact sort of measurement of resources. How do we get all those people together, as well as tying in people from, in the government and policy who are trying to manage and understand where projects are? Because I think, as you also said towards the end, we really want to actually filter out those projects which are going to go absolutely nowhere. That saves money. That saves that if you can speak to local people and tell them that this project will provide value, I think that is really useful and really important. And getting that message across is worth some projects, unfortunately, being filtered out, possibly.
Well, Matt, you're an expert in it because you've spoken a lot before about the 1 in 1,000 statistic, and it's in my head, it's not about having 1 in 1,000 and making that 100 in 1,000. It's about getting the 1,000 down to 10.
Yeah, it's that kind of the way that we used to do projects just isn't working and isn't going to work in the future, how we used to align them. And so one of the big challenges that I see is this assumption that something like the EU Critical Raw Materials Act is going to create the environment and the incentives that these projects are going to succeed. And I see UNFC as being one of those kind of frameworks can put things into context and show how, maybe not just from the technical feasibility and the geological context, the E side of things is just as important. But I can almost argue that the E side is that you need it just as important as the other ones. Whereas I think previously it's always been, we'll get there when we have to. It's just as important, and maybe if that's what UNFC can use to communicate, then fine. But ultimately, I don't think it on its own is going to barely make that difference and change how we get those next generation of projects come through that pipeline. We need something else that allows the UNFC to kind of elevate this kind of industry to the challenge that we're all kind of trying to face.
And I guess ultimately that's that systems level thinking approach that we've discussed before, from exploration through to reclamation. And then that's us only talking about, an extraction based project, when the purpose again of UNFC is either, rightly really hammered home for anybody who wasn't aware, is there's a circularity element here, the application of it to recycling, to refinement processes, all of those sorts of things as well. So I guess with that overview of what we found out that we were looking forward to, was there anything that really stood out to you as a point that's made that maybe you weren't expecting, or has reframed your perspective as our one lesson learned before we wrap up what's been a really interesting series?
I mean, I was thinking about looking back through the series. An interesting thing is both Vitor Correa and Ed Sides both talked about a mine in Iberia, different mines, I believe, both in the Iberian Pyrite Belt, because these were both pyrite mines. And they really focused on this sort of consolidated integration of the sort of whole value chain. So these mines were pyrite mines, one in Portugal, one in Spain. They were producing pyrite, the addition of phosphate from other mining resources, and then they were outputting copper, sulfuric acid, fertilizer. And the integration sort of strategy in both cases ended up building schools, building docks, building a local community, which lasted for decades after some of these projects have closed down. And I guess to me, I think this really speaks to the idea of maybe viewing a parcel of land as not only the surface, but as the subsurface, not only the economic value, but the social, environmental value of that land parcel. And I think that's really interesting because I think there's also, beyond that spatial term, there's also that sort of all those human terms of economics and society. There's also the temporal term, sort of viewing it through time and how it develops. And I don't think this is where UNFC is possibly now, but maybe looking far into the future, maybe it's sort of final form or maybe a future form. Maybe that's where UNFC could support and develop this sort of grander context of how to use land and understand land and compare it as close as you can in an apples to way for governments, for society, for the local stakeholders.
Yeah, for me, I think it was that, if I'm honest, I was very skeptical. It's just another process, actually, who's going to care about it? I think that's where I started off as. Like, why is the UNFC such an interesting thing for me as an exploration geologist who wants to try and develop projects? And one thing that came through for me throughout the whole series was that, yeah, it's actually more of a communication tool to align people. So it's this kind of, a way to kind of harmonize all different parts of the sector and show this potential viability, rather than like a tool for, financial markets or regulators or other things like that. So for me, it was that kind of reframe. It kind of flipped the purpose of it on its head for me, and it gave me a bit more of a pragmatic view on what it could be used for.
It's quite a future-oriented system, and maybe talking to enough people through these episodes really made some of those cogs click into place in my brain about, okay, so other types of reporting, you report them year on year, but they kind of, it's the most recent one that's useful, whereas there's an element of the legacy of UNFC, or the usefulness of UNFC improves with every iteration you do it for a project, to kind of understand the dynamism of both the project or the region, if you're looking at all of those different projects in one portfolio, or you can scale that up and down as you like, but that almost legacy data providing just as much quality content and ability to take learnings about the future. So I really thought about that, particularly with Erica's comments. I think that's the one that's really nestled in my brain, very much so, kind of building upon the evidence and comments everybody else posted. But yeah, I think it's been a really successful series. I guess that there's not much else to do than to say a massive thank you to everybody for listening and joining us on this journey. Hopefully you've learned something too. And you'll refer back to these in the future. Please do spread the good word about UNFC as you see fit. Keep building on these conversations, and hopefully, as things progress, we can revisit this in the future and involve a lot of your perspectives and opinions. So do reach out with any thoughts that you might have that you'd like including in discussion, or engage with it on social media. Thanks ever so much for listening. We look forward to seeing you on our next podcast adventure.
The views, thoughts and opinions expressed by guests or contributors on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, Satala and Critical Productions. Any statements made should not be interpreted as endorsements or official positions. Listener discretion is advised.